putting the light-skinned girls in one hotel and the darkest girls in another hotel.
And I think that it's sad because it's a book that actually talked about colorism, just to use someone who's benefiting from colorism.
I want to be white, like I look.
Like oftentimes in media, the biracial daughter who happens to be light-skinned most of the time is depicted as desirable.
Because colorism and its depiction of film will always have the lighter-skinned woman as a love interest and will mammify or desexualize plus-size and dark-skinned women.
Today we'll be talking about everyone's favorite topic, which is not at all controversial or politically charged. I kid. We'll actually be talking about colorism, specifically colorism in relation to the film industry, also known as you're a filmmaker who's receiving a master's in data analysis and asked to choose a graduate thesis topic during Black History Month. Race and film have been reasonably studied over the years, most notably in regards to stereotypes in earlier days of the motion picture industry, blackface, and limiting storylines for these characters. The 1960s and 70s saw a new wave of storylines for these characters, calling for social reform and the quote-unquote end of racism, while still acknowledging their majority white audiences. Take this snippet from the book, Expanding the Black Film Canon, Race and Gender Across 6 Decades. In the Heat of the Night is well known for Virgil Tibbs, played by Sidney Poitier's slap heard around the world.
Was Mr. Colbert ever in this greenhouse, say last night about midnight?
However, it was Rod Steiger's performance of Gillespie that won the Oscar for Best Actor. Furthermore, the same Sidney Poitier would be the first Black actor to win an Oscar for a leading role. That wouldn't happen again until 2001 with Denzel Washington and Halle Berry, 37 years later. But that's not what I want to pay attention to. We see a lot more Black winners after 2001, playing a rogue detective, a famous musician, a Ugandan dictator, and the wife of a prisoner. Out of these wins, the only one that can be argued to have racism at the center of its story is Halle Berry in Monsters Ball. However, unlike films from the civil rights era, this movie isn't fighting for the end of racism. In fact, one could say racism wins in the end when Letitia doesn't confront Hank about his involvement in her husband's death. Let's take a look. This is where she finds out. Let's fast forward a bit. And here's the end of the film. Her character is exhausted after the loss of her husband and basically just gives up. While character limitations for the purposes of this video focuses on the Black diaspora, it should be noted that these issues exist within many minority groups. For instance, Michelle Yeoh would be the first Asian to win an Oscar for a leading role for her part in Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. And this wasn't until 2023. Where historically many minorities have been given roles of stereotypes or side characters that help the white lead, it seems when we move away from these common tropes and let diverse groups tell diverse stories, great movies are made. While racism focuses on division between ethnic and racial groups, colorism is most often seen in-group. Wilder explains, colonialism brought more than slavery into the United States. A racist ideology followed, which cultivated a system of language, classification, and domination privileging whiteness over blackness. Skin tone bias is perhaps the most permanent feature of slavery, dividing the Black community as long as racism has divided America. To be clear, this video is not about arguing whether colorism exists. There's plenty of research to support its existence, as well as many people more qualified for that discussion than myself. Furthermore, this video is not about colorism as a whole across all minority groups. Lighter skin is preferred in many places, such as South Korea, where artists are commonly whitewashed to appear lighter in photos. Side note, this is crazy. We also see skin lightening practices in Jamaica with the use of bleaching creams, something that is not only uncommon among Black Americans, but would be greatly looked down upon. The same is seen in India, as shared in this BBC article. A woman who lives in New Zealand and ethnically Indian visits India and was, quote, struck by the amount of pressure there was for people to change the color of their skin. That's not to say skin tone altering only moves in the direction of lighter. Spray tanning is a thriving market worth $362 million as of 2024. Ads for new tanning sprays and lotions are marketed on every social platform, not to mention the use of makeup to achieve a more tanned look. Furthermore, indoor tanning is still a common activity for many despite its well-known dangers, including a 75% increased risk of developing life-threatening melanoma. I am limited by my own experience as an American and cannot address these cultural tendencies with the appropriate nuance. That being said, I would highly encourage anyone within those minority groups to conduct their own research so that I can read it. For the purpose of my thesis, I'll be doing what my background and degree has prepared me to do. Get some data, code some pretty graphs, and turn it into a video. Which means our first stop is the data. I'll be using a dataset from Kaggle that supplies film data from 2000 to 2024. And don't worry, I chose a few films at random to double check that the data is accurate. I'll be adding some extra columns to this data: actor, franchise, gender, genre, inflated revenue, order, revenue class, and skin tone. Some of these are self-explanatory and some are not. Let's go through them. Franchise is quite simple. There needs to be real, alive human beings in a media-made prequel that will then turn into a sequel. This includes Broadway, film, and television. The original media is considered non-franchise, whereas the follow-up movie is included under franchise. If it doesn't have real people, it's not included. So a comic book that's turned into a movie is not franchise. An animated show that was turned into an animated film that was turned into a movie is not franchise. This also goes for films based on real people, meaning not media-made. Real people whose stories are turned into a movie are not franchise. Real people whose stories are turned into a book that's turned into a movie is not franchise. All right, I think we got it. Let's move on. Gender. Now, before anyone goes throwing tomatoes my way, please note that none of the characters represented in the data had a gender identity other than he or her, which also matched their assigned sex. All data is marked with an M or an F for simplicity. That doesn't mean there are no trans or non-binary characters that exist. Simply, these characters are not in the first 3 credits of films from 2000 to 2024. Moving on. Genre. Let's take a look at the film Joker, in addition to our dataset due to Zazie Beetz, a baddie. Now, one could argue this movie has action as there is a violent riot at the end of the movie. You could also say the movie has adventure as Arthur Fleck climbs his way to the top of comedy. Since we're talking about comedy, there is also that stand-up scene that I'm sure someone somewhere chuckled. And the list goes on. The thing is, there always tends to be one genre a movie falls more easily into. Fast 5 is definitely an action movie. 21 Jump Street is a comedy. Get Out is a horror film. Unstoppable is all thrills, no breaks. Star Wars is an adventure through the cosmos. 12 Years a Slave is a movie full of drama that I will not watch. And Save the Last Dance is a love story. You get the point. Each film will have one genre assigned to it. Let's move on. I'll be inflating my revenue on a yearly basis using the U.S. inflation calculator. I'll only be collecting data on films that have made at least $200 million and had a widespread theatrical release in the United States. This is to weed out small independent films with limited releases that would skew our data. Easy peasy. Order. I'll only be looking at actors in the first 3 credits. The goal is to focus on main characters only. Fun fact, some movies order their credits alphabetically. This is stupid, mostly because it made my life harder. For this reason, I'll be double-checking that the top credited actors are also in IMDb's stars section. And then there's times when IMDb makes no sense to me. For instance, Scary Movie 2 has a man named Anthony Acker in its stars section. Yet, Mr. Actor plays a partygoer, a non-main role, and also has no photo.
That's suspicious.
In this case, if you're on the promotional poster or in the trailer, you're considered a main role, meaning Shawn Wayans will be included in the data alongside his brother Marlon. Next up, revenue class. This is less important for analysis and more important for the predictive model I'll be making later on. Here are the ranges the classes represent. Class 1 is under 400 million, Class 2 is under 600 million, Class 3 is under 800 million, all the way up to 1 billion plus. The vast majority of movies make less than $1 billion. In fact, the vast majority of movies make less than $400 million. For this reason, even films that make up to $2 billion in revenue will receive a Class 5 designation. Lastly, we've got skin tone, and for this I need to go on to explain how I'll be categorizing skin tone. To do this, I'll be using foundation shades from MAC's Studio Fix foundation line, the largest major foundation line, and yes, I checked Fenty. Everybody relax. Our data is based on perception. Based on this, the models are ordered by how light or dark their skin would be perceived by others. I'll then take the highlights and shadows from each image and blend them together to find the model's midtone. Remember, skin tone is not the only feature that can identify someone's ethnicity. All tones will be considered from lightest to darkest. Now, colloquially, the Black community has their own ways of categorizing skin color, from light bright, yellow bone, red bone, brown skin, and dark skin. However, these terms are not well defined and arguably problematic depending on who you ask. How about simpler terms? Light skin, medium skin, and dark skin? However, as you can see, light-skinned individuals would encompass most of the shades and leave little room for more narrow designations. We could try splitting the models by individuals who could be perceived as Black and individuals who wouldn't. Clearly, that won't work as this topic doesn't actually discuss race. Instead, the order of models will become our tone reference chart, ordered in sections of 11 from 1 to 6. Each character will have 2 images taken under different lighting within movies. I'll grab the midtone from each image and blend these to find an average midtone. These will be compared against our reference sheet and added to our data. I get that this seems like a lot of work. I even checked the accuracy of myself against the shade I would wear in MAC foundation. Here is a picture of my forehead. The circle you see above it is my midtone shade from that photo. This is my actual shade. And this is the closest shade based on only color swatches. What's important is that while these shades weren't exact, they were in the same tone, meaning I would receive an accurate tone distinction even if it's not perfect. Of course, there will be some challenges. For instance, movies can often have highly stylized color choices. For these cases, I'll alter the hue of the shade while keeping the saturation and contrast the same. This image has green taken out of it. This one has less blue, and this one has less red. Now these look like more natural skin tones. Speaking of natural skin tones, not all characters are actually human, even if their actor is of the Black diaspora. Here, Zoe Saldana is green. Here, also Zoe Saldana is blue. And here, Paula Patton is chartreuse. None of these characters will be included in the data. However, if a Black actor isn't colored unnaturally for at least 2 scenes of the movie, this will be included. Take Will Smith in Aladdin. Back to the word of the day, which is perception. This brings us to the question of white passing individuals. To decide whether this individual would be included or not, I'll be asking the question, if this person told me one of their parents is Black, would I be surprised? Take these 3 examples. Halsey is partially Black American and identifies as such. However, viewers who know nothing about her would not perceive her as Black. For this reason, she would not be included. This is partially Black Wentworth Miller, arguably having one of the best names in the entertainment industry. Now, I really struggled with this one, mostly because he could tell me he's any ethnicity outside of East Asian and I would believe him. For this reason, he is included, but with hesitation. Now, this guy in the middle, that's Robert Downey Jr. Yeah, Iron Man Robert Downey Jr., who was very much a white man. Nevertheless, if someone had no idea who Robert Downey Jr. is and they saw Tropic Thunder, they may perceive him to be Black, as that is how he spends most of the movie. For this reason, he is included. I can only imagine the film pitch.
So I've got a fantastic idea. We put actors in a jungle, and one of them will be method acting while in blackface.
There's, of course, the issue of actors who are not Black Americans. But remember, our data is based on perception. Therefore, if Americans who know nothing about an actor would think they're Black, for the purposes of this study, they are Black. Basically, if you look like you have an ancestor from the past 500 years originating in sub-Saharan Africa, you're Black. At least in this research, I am not trying to erase your culture. Please don't cancel me. Lastly, before we get to our analysis, lighting and film color grading can result in significant differences in skin tone perception. Take Octavia Spencer in The Help and Octavia Spencer in Hidden Figures. Same actor, different color swatch. Not only that, when compared against our reference chart, her closest match falls under 2 different tones. For this reason, a similar actor may have a different tone designation depending on the film. However, since this is the tone the audience will see, it is the tone that will be used in our data collection. That's our method, and that's our data. So you may be wondering, what did it uncover? Now, quick house cleaning before we begin. For those watching who can't remember anything from their AP statistics class in high school, I've got a simplified crash course for you. For the purposes of this video, you'll only need to understand a few things: normal distribution curves, confidence intervals, trend lines, correlation coefficients, and p-values. This is a normal distribution curve, which, according to Google, is a symmetric bell-shaped probability distribution where data clusters around a central mean. So let's say you're collecting the average weight of women from age 18 to 35 in a certain city. Now, technically this data is more accurate the more data you have, but I'm not going to animate all of that. Anyhoodle, after some time, you'll see the data has the tendency to peak at a certain value. This value is the mean. And that purple shade, that's a normal distribution curve. Population studies just really like this curve. These curves also tell us something else. That middle section encompasses 68% of the data, then 95%, then 99.7%. These are confidence intervals. In other words, I'm 68% confident a random woman from the age of 18 to 35 will be between 150 and 180 pounds. The lines that separate these sections represent standard deviations. As you can see, the closer to 0 your standard deviation, the closer your result is to your average. Super simple. Let's move on. Say we work at a hospital and want to see the effect temperature has on how many incidents of heat stroke we see at the hospital. Well, we can put these beautiful bars in place and add a line, and boom, you figured out trend lines. These tell us what direction Y will go when X does a thing. In this case, heat stroke incidents trend upwards when temperature increases. Trend lines are also commonly used when discussing correlation. There is a problem though. Correlation is calculated from individual points. Our beautiful bar graph is in groups. Not a problem, let's change this to a scatter plot. Each dot represents a day within the year and the number of heat stroke incidents from that day. Please remember, this is not real data and I am not drawing 365 circles. Now we can add our correlation coefficient. But wait.
Oh my God, what is that?
Correlation coefficients are given in a number from -1 to 1. At 0.96, our correlation is very close to 1, meaning data points closely align to our trend line, with X increasing as Y increases. Now let's say people are actually more likely to stay inside and not expose themselves to heat as it gets warmer. What would our data look like? Perhaps our plot does a full 180. Now we can see our incidents seem to decrease as it gets warmer. This gives us a negative 0.96. Our points are still closely located near our trend line, they're just explaining the opposite relationship. Finally, what if people most often get heat stroke by having their thermostat too high? So, hypothetically, weather is not a factor at all. In this case, our graph may look something like this. That's our trend line. And that's our correlation coefficient, which is quite close to 0. A 0 correlation coefficient is less about the direction of the trend and more about the lack of trend. Data points seem to be random and really pay no attention to X or Y. In general, the trend is not the main purpose of using a coefficient. It is most useful to see if two variables affect one another in a significant way. Therefore, you are going to see me include coefficients on bar charts. I assure you these were calculated with individual data points, but there is little reason to make two charts. Ask yourself, is it close to 1 or -1? That is all that matters. Thank you. Lastly, we have p-value. In statistics, you have a hypothesis and a null hypothesis. People like to complicate this, but it's actually very simple. Let's say you believe hot temperatures mean more heat stroke incidents. What you're really saying is that temperature will affect how many heat stroke cases your hospital receives. That's your hypothesis. You will always have a null hypothesis. It's not the opposite of your hypothesis that heat stroke cases actually decrease as temperature rises. It's instead saying that there is no significant effect at all. Just focus on the N. Null equals no effect. So next time you cringe when someone says reject the null hypothesis, know that they're simply saying that variables within a study do seem to impact each other. Now, let's focus on the word significance. That's where p-value comes in. P-value is looking for how likely an outcome of an experiment or study occurred by chance. And it's often misunderstood, so pay attention. Say we go back to our near zero temperature and heat stroke scatter plot. We can find the p-value using this formula. Or if you're living in the 21st century, like myself, you can enter this code. Let's say it returns a p-value of 0.8967. Well, we can make this number a percentage, so 90%, meaning there is a 90% chance our results occurred simply by chance and not due to temperature. Let's say we use our negative scatter plot instead. Now we get a p-value of 0.0314, or 3%, meaning there is a 3% chance our results happened by chance. In general, 0.05 is the standard p-value to show significance. However, certain experiments can require lower accepted p-values, like in clinical trials. Others are more lenient, such as early phase studies that may use small samples and simply see if it's worth it to use resources to explore a possible relationship. Please note that 0.1 is not common, and even these exploratory studies will usually increase their accepted p-value for the fully produced research. To simplify, low p-values indicate high significance in results. High p-values indicate low significance in results. These need to be decided before your research begins and are typically 0.05. That's the end of our Statistics 101 class. Yes, this is incredibly oversimplified and I missed a lot of information, but it is enough for you to understand the results if you don't work in statistics regularly, and quite frankly, this script is already much longer than I intended. Let's look at the data overall. For all data points, our data has a mean skin tone of 4.62, with the highest number of actors falling within the skin tone category of 5. This trend appears to continue from 2000 to 2024, with a correlation coefficient of about 0.0153. In other words, year doesn't seem to have much effect on the skin tone of hired actors. Of the 7 possible genres, action is the most common genre for our data and romance is the least. Lastly, despite the ratio of available films being near equal at 48% and 52% respectively, franchise movies tend to return significantly more revenue than non-franchise films. From here, we can start asking more difficult questions. Let's look at credit order first. Given the majority of our actors fall under the skin tone designation of 5, it was not a surprise that the highest percentage of actors would also fall in this range. However, our results are a bit more interesting when applying a normal distribution curve. The data shows mean skin tone trends lower as credit order trends lower. Here's our actors who are listed third in the credits. They have an average tone of about 5.3. Here's our second order actors who have a mean tone of about 5.2. Not much of a difference, but look at the jump when we go to first order actors. Black main characters in film have an average skin tone of about 4.4, an entire tone 9 to 10 shades lighter. Now, let's take a look at genre. We've got action, adventure, comedy, drama, horror, romance, and thriller. Now, there are significant limitations with our analysis here. I'll explain more on this later. But what we can see is that adventure is the only genre where the number of actors hired follows the trend of inflated revenue. Action, comedy, drama, horror, and thriller saw higher inflated revenue for lighter skin tones, while the number of hired actors peaked in a darker shade. In other words, the data implies that we hire more actors at tone 5, but actors at lighter skin tones perform better at the box office for those genres. Romance was the only genre that revealed no discernible trend. While actors peaked at the same skin tone, we see inflated revenue peak. There is a sharp drop-off for higher tone 5 actors despite no major decrease in inflated revenue for these films. How about film ratings? Typically, we assume that movies that are well-received will make more money. Let's see if that's correct. I'll only be using non-franchise films for this, as movies that have been given a sequel are assumed to do well. Our average rating for all skin tones has a range of 0.88 out of 10. In other words, there's a 9% difference from our highest average score to our lowest average score. However, 97.5% of our data falls between tones 3 and 6. In this case, there's only a range of 0.25 out of 10, or about a 3% difference. Basically, our movies seem to receive very similar ratings despite skin tone. Assuming that a movie's rating has an impact on their revenue, we'd expect to see revenue spread similarly across tones 3 through 6. However, the data actually shows a peak in revenue for tone 4 actors. When we look at the data, including franchise films, we find a correlation coefficient of 0.1139 and a p-value of 0.0557. This indicates that the rating of films with Black actors do not show a close correlation to the film's revenue, regardless of skin tone. Moving on. Perhaps the most apparent effect is through the variable of gender. When we look at overall proportions by skin tone and gender, male actors are more represented by darker shades, 67.64% with tones 5 or 6, while female actors are more represented by lighter shades, 60.53% with tones 1 to 4. Keep in mind, Zendaya received a tone 4 designation in Dune. Considering numbers alone, 4 is on the dark side of the 1 to 6 scale. However, a tone 4 actor would still be considered colloquially as light-skinned among Black individuals. Given that this study is based on perception, women are overwhelmingly represented by lighter shades. We see this sentiment echoed when looking at the top 10 male and female actors. Among men, the actors hired for the most films have an average skin tone of 5.6. In contrast, women hired for the most acting roles have an average skin tone of 4.09. This represents a range of 1.51 in skin tone, or about a 25% difference between men and women. Quick side note, we must stop allowing The Rock to get away with playing the same character over and over again. I have never trusted someone less to save me from a natural disaster. Now, to be fair, some do say the same about Denzel. However, I do not accept this.
I'm the man up in this piece. You'll never see the light of who the f*** you think you f***ing with. I'm the police. I run here. You just live here. Yeah, that's right, you better walk away. Go on, walk away, because I'm going to burn this motherfucker down. King Kong ain't got on me.
Also, this isn't even true. Denzel has carried this industry on his back since 1981 with nothing but a dream and a 2-week-old lineup. Please don't piss me off. Interestingly, revenue and first credited seem to show a much smaller difference in skin tone between women and men. See how there's only a top 8 instead of a top 10? That's because women are underrepresented as first credited actors. This may be because, as we can see, male-led films tend to make more revenue when compared to female-led films. However, the average skin tones are quite similar at 4.25 and 4.125 for men and women respectively. This represents only about a 2% difference in average skin tone of actors hired for a main role. Now, ladies, before we grab our pitchforks, you should know that this trend appears to be changing. As we can see, average skin tone for women seems to be darkening, while average skin tone for men seems to be lightening. While this is great news in the sense that Black actors are becoming more represented in various shades, there are significant limitations in this research. The major limitation faced during this research process was the lack of film data available. For example, on average, 36.4 movies that met requirements for analysis were released yearly. Only 11.32% had Black actors in any of the first 3 credits. The lack of available data was especially seen when analyzing genre as a variable. If you recall, 5 of the 7 genres had no data for 1 or more of the possible skin tones. While Afrocentric features do not solely depend on skin tone, it may be ideal for future testing to combine tones 1 through 3, as tones 1 and 2 are significantly underrepresented in the data. When addressing this issue, perhaps colloquial designations may also be considered in terms of how Black Americans categorize skin tone within their culture. From there, categories can be further narrowed for a more representative population. 2020 also saw the beginning of COVID-19, which had a major effect on the number of movies being released. Pre-COVID-19 saw 41.4 average films released yearly, with about 9% containing Black actors. This dropped to 16.4 average yearly releases, while the percent containing Black actors increased to about 18% from 2020 to 2024. This greatly limited the accessible data while also skewing analysis in those later years. For example, the prevalence of Black actors in film shows an overall increase from 2000 to 2024, with a moderate positive correlation. However, the correlation is considered low between 2000 and 2019. I would love to tell you that overall Black actors are more represented as time has gone on, and if we look at the data, it could show this. However, when 2020 and beyond is taken out of consideration, percent of actors actually stays quite consistent. Based on the available data, gender and credit orders show the most significant effect on film revenue and actor occurrence through the lens of colorism. Female actors saw higher frequencies across films at lighter skin tones, while the opposite is true for male actors. In regards to credit order, first credited actors show the highest prevalence with a tone designation of 4. This number increases as the order in credit increases, possibly suggesting that actors with lighter skin tones tend to be hired more often for more important roles. As a disclaimer, it would be disingenuous to posit the findings from this study are comprehensive or at all indicative of causation when considering the rigor required for an effective scientific method. It is my hope that the research outlined above can be used as a possible method to be further expounded upon in topics revolving around colorism in the Black community as well as other minority groups. Besides, when we compare films with Black actors to all films from 2000 to 2024, they make similar amounts of money on average. And let's be honest, that's what the studios really care about. Also, if you guys would like to try out my model, I left a link for it down below. And before you ask, I can confirm that my written thesis contained 0 memes.